Welcome to Section 5, Security and Identity and Access Management. Now, we know that, of course, securing our resources is very important, and AWS, of course, has a wide portfolio of capabilities. For this course, I want to discuss some of the main services that I think are worth talking about for a fundamentals course, and I'll also go into some of the best practices that I think are really important to understand. Now, we'll talk about the services that are available. We'll talk about IAM mainly. I'll go through some demos on Security Hub as well. We'll talk about guard duty. And I think it's important, too, to understand what is called the shared security model. And basically, this is a course where the consumer and the provider have responsibilities around security. So we want to know, what exactly do we do in AWS and what does AWS exactly do? We'll then talk about security best practices. And again, this is an area that we can really consider to be important, because when we decide to deploy services in AWS, it's really important to understand the scope of the service, but also to what are the best practices that we could use to add additional layers of security and also prevent issues down the road possibly. With that said, let us move on to the next part of the course. AWS Security Services. Really important to understand the different options around AWS Security Services. There's so many services around security. It's definitely a whole course in itself to go through every one in detail. I'm going to go through pretty much 85% of them and give you an idea of why you want to use them, and again, some of the common use cases with these services. And then the course will, of course, get deeper into some of the services as well with some demos and whiteboards. When it comes to AWS Security Services, generally there's any number of reasons we of course would want to use these services. But one of the common areas around using security services is that they can provide you certainly automation capabilities, a managed service as well. For example, if we're using services for data protection, threat detection, a lot of these capabilities are going to be fully managed and automated, and that can certainly take a workload off of your staff, off of your enterprise. And if you're not having to worry about defending against DDoS attacks, that's great, because you've already have the services in place to deal with that. When it comes to services, these services can scale. There's a partner ecosystem. For example, if for some reason you're not happy or let's say, for example, the application firewall WAF isn't good enough for your use case, or doesn't meet the use case, or whatever the reason is, you could extend out to third-party solutions, for example, from Palo Alto if you want, or CloudGenix or Sophos, or whoever you may be using in your ecosystem. They're programmable, and then the subscription model is typically either free. Some are basically free for a certain amount of service use, and then some are pay-as-you-go, or even also, I should say, subscription-based, especially if you go with a marketplace solution. Now, types of security services will be focused on data protection. Data protection generally is more focused on encryption, key management, threat detection, continually monitoring your workloads. Identity and access management is basically, again, how to provide basically applications and workloads and your user base, basically the proper access to your workloads and applications. Infrastructure protection is really meant to protect your applications against basically issues around, for example, SQL injection, cross-site scripting, That could be like using the WAF, the Web Application Firewall, for example. And then threat detection, for example, again, could be more around using continuous monitoring. This sort of falls into data protection, but there are specific tools that we could use for this. And then also with compliance and data privacy as well. For example, there's tools we could use for data loss protection. We could use, for example, automated compliance checks to mitigate issues from a legal perspective. So many great capabilities with AWS services. Now, some of the services we'll discuss, again, briefly here. We'll talk about each one. But basically, I do want to go into some of the demos on, for example, Security Hub, Trusted Advisor, GuardDuty, etc. Those are some of the services you'll be using at scale typically. Also IAM. Now, some of these services, again, are really important, for example, such as Security Hub. This is really a newer solution in the last few years, I believe, maybe 2 years. And what Security Hub does is it allows you as an enterprise to bring together all your security requirements and compliance requirements into a single view. So it's more or less as an aggregate for monitoring and management. GuardDuty. Now, GuardDuty is a threat detection service. There's a lot of great capabilities around, for example, automation, notifications, etc. Cloud HSM. Now, Cloud HSM is a security service that we could use, especially around when we need to manage basically our keys. So it's basically a hardware key manager, and we want to use this typically when we have regulatory compliance to deal with. Amazon Inspector. This is a tool we would use to analyze our application security. This is, I like to call this sort of like the preemptor, right? This is something you want to use before you deploy. There's also Key Management Services, KMS. So KMS is another service similar to HSM in some respects, to where we could manage our keys, for example, in AWS. It's for key storage and management. Trusted Advisor. Now, Trusted Advisor is not just a security service, but it also does as well have some checks around security as well. So we want to consider that because of the fact that part of the components of Trusted Advisor do run basically best practices and does almost like a sort of a consistent review of your services basically with AWS. So it's a tool that is useful. And also, too, the security checks are free, so it's really hard not to want to use Trusted Advisor. And I'll go through a demo on that. Now, CloudTrail, this is a service that I think sometimes doesn't get as much attention as it should, but it's important to use, especially with your monitoring and compliance requirements. It's meant to provide what's called an audit trail. Now, as far as some of the other services like SSO, single sign-on, again, pretty straightforward why we want to use SSO. Basically, SSO is meant to provide us more of a federation, unification of our access. Cognito. Now, AWS Cognito is another tool we could use, especially around identity and access management. It's really meant to integrate our applications with basically best practices and tools for identity management. Now, directory services is a tool we could use for basically, Active Directory, Microsoft Active Directory. This is, again, a tool you're going to use typically if you're using Microsoft Active Directory. And then Resource Manager. Resource Manager is actually also known as Resource Access Manager, and this is a service to share resources. Then we have config. Config is actually a tool that has some overlap, like, for example, Trusted Advisor and, for example, Detective. Amazon Detective is another tool that's available in Artifact. Basically, it has some overlap there. But config, from a use case perspective, is actually really important because it's going to go ahead and record and evaluate our configs for our resources. And when we're using config, we of course want to configure our resources in a manner that is safe and secure. So if we make any changes, it's going to identify that and let us know. And also too provides a history of changes and a lot of great capabilities. Now, some of the overlap from networking tools like WAF, for example, Web Application Firewall. This is a tool we'd use, of course, to mitigate security issues on our network, mainly to filter malicious web traffic. And then AWS Shield. Now, AWS Shield is really meant for DDoS protection, and we talked about that in the network service as well. So some of the services, again, can overlap between certain areas as well in AWS. Now, when it comes to security services, it's important to realize, too, that we could use these services in any number of ways. We could use, for example, the WAF firewall. We could use third-party tools. Could be F5, Palo Alto, could be Sophos, could be Cisco, whatever we want to use and is supported, we could use. And again, if we have, for example, application users, we may want to use a type of firewall to validate against our web application. Is this traffic acceptable or is it not? And then we could run, for example, Security Hub as a way to provide compliance checks. And this is an easy way for a security team to basically bring together some of the services to really up the ante in our compliance and security posture. That's about all that I had for this module. Let's move on to the next part of the course. Let's talk about identity and access management. Now, under IAM, it's actually a pretty wide area. There's a lot to talk about there. So let's select IAM. When we go to IAM, one of the first things we're going to see is basically the IAM dashboard here. And you can see on the left, we have our subsections we could select. And then when we scroll down, we get search. For example, if we want to look for a security group or a specific setting, a tag, whatever, this will help us identify that. First off, you can see here that it summarizes your total resources. Right now, I didn't have any users set up. I didn't have any policies there for the default. And I have 8 roles set up. With that said, you can see the security status is saying, Joe, you only have 1 out of 5 areas completed. So maybe what you need to do, and again, what is recommended is to get these to turn green. First thing is to apply what is called multi-factor authentication. Now, with multi-factor authentication, the way this would work is you need to, of course, have a password and then go down here and then activate it. And then you need your access keys. And then you would also create additional keys and certificates as well down here. So this would be basically a highlight of your security credentials. Now, when I go back to the dashboard, again, you would want to go through and add users. Now, again, because this is an intro course and a demo that I'm going through, it's just more of a show and tell. But if I go here and manage users, I could simply just add a new user and basically say Joe EBS. So let's just say it is for Elastic Beanstalk. I could give this programmatic or console access. Now, programmatic is going to be for the API or the CLI SDK. Now, I like to say that a programmatic access is really a service account in other cloud providers is really what it is. And then I could select the console. I could auto-generate a password or create a custom password. And I'll just go ahead and create that. And then I could also mandate a password reset. And then when I set permissions, for example, I could create a group. Now, the best practice is to really start creating groups. And why is that? Because you may have administrators, you may have report generators, you may have developers, production engineers, whatever the roles are. You want to set up roles first and then add users to them after. So if you don't have any groups set up, go ahead and set up a group. And let's just say I'm going to make that role part of Elastic, actually, not Cache, but Beanstalk. And when we scroll down here, you have Elastic Cache, MapReduce, and again, just need to figure out the exact syntax. Here it is right there. So AWS, Elastic, and if I put that a little bit closer, that should actually pull it up. Okay, so you could see there, this is where I'd want to go. And then you could see each of these over here. This is a worker, this is a web tier, a service. This is read-only access. This is full access to EBS, so I would probably want to say that. And then create group for EBS administrators. And it says that there's an error. So what is the error? It says that the member needs to be addressed. Okay, so that's easy enough. So what I want to do now is just make sure I correct that. Okay, so now what I've done is I've created the EBS admin group, and I've attached the policy of Elastic Beanstalk full access. Now, what should happen is that this EBS admin group, when I select that, you can see that there's no users to that. So what I want to do now is add a user. Okay, so let's go ahead and add a user. What we want to do first is let's go ahead and cancel out. And then what we want to do is go over here to users. You can see here there's no users that have been populated. So let's add a user. I'm going to go ahead and add a Joe H, let's say, EBS. So I know that it's me and I'll be an EBS admin. So I'll add myself to the group. I'm going to give myself console access in this point. And then as I had showed you earlier, you go ahead and set your password as well. And then basically, I'm going to deselect that, go to permissions. And then what I would do is add that user to EBS admin. And then if I want tags, I could go ahead and add tags. So let's go ahead and say EBS. Whoops. And then I'll put admin. Next review. And let's just double check a few things. So the group is EBS admin. The key is going to be EBS and the value is admin. And then this is basically Joe H EBS. And I'll go ahead and create the user. All right, so that user has been created. And then over here, when I create a user, I could send an email to that user to log in. It'll give them the password, the link to click, actually. And this would be the sign-in link here. Again, you can see it'll bring us over to the IAM users login. Now, one thing to point out is that this will populate their account ID. And one thing to be aware of, though, this is a little different than the root login, for example. It'll have the account ID, and then they need to put in their username and password here. So, for example, if I go Joe H, I think it's EBS. Let me just double check. And Joe H EBS, okay. And then I put in the password here. Okay, that'll log me in. And you can see there, I'm now Joe H. EBS. So I'll go ahead and close that. Now, what I could do here is, because I only have Elastic Beanstalk, I should be able to go over here and then deploy an application. So that really is a summary of how this could work. Now, for the purpose of this demo, we'll go ahead and move on. Let's go ahead and move that. And I have to log in again to root. So let's go ahead and log me out. And I'm going to log back in. Okay, I'm logged back in now. Let's go ahead and go back to IAM. And now you can see, as I've added a group and IAM users, those green check marks have actually updated. And now I have 3 out of 5 complete. The next thing I want to talk about, since we talked about groups and users, now let's go to roles. Now, roles are going to be another way that we could go ahead and sort of be a little bit more granular. For example, groups we might want to use, for example, names or groups of people that are pretty, like, I guess, not as granular as a role. So what would be an example? The example would be developers or development or production. And then roles would be, for example, mobile developer or cloud developer. Those would be more specific roles. Or developers, it's just that they're a role that's a little bit more specific. So for example, maybe our mobile developers do need access to EBS. However, our Golang developers may not use EBS, and they may just use containers instead. Whatever that scenario is, we want to set up a role to address that. Policies. Now, a policy is pretty much what it sounds like. We're going to create basically a policy, or better yet, a permission set is another way to look at it, to make sure that our users only use certain services and have only certain permissions in those services. Again, this builds on multiple steps here, as you can see. And then identity providers. One of the things we could do is create a provider, and you could see that we could use SAML or OpenID. And then we could also go down to account settings. This will basically set a password for the account. This will also allow us to edit or activate certain endpoints as well. And then reports. I go over to reports and actually start up what's called the Access Analyzer. And as part of this, this will give us some really good insight into basically who is using the accounts, how are they using the accounts, etc. And then down here, we have some other reports that we could look at as well. Lastly, down here is where we would find our AWS account ID. Now, the account ID is important to know because this is also tied into, for example, the marketplace solutions, and we may need to enter that to start up or connect a service, for example. Also, to the users will need that when they log in. Now, as a root account, we don't really need to memorize that per se, but it is something we want to note, for example. That's about the extent of the demo I wanted to go through with IAM for this specific part of the course. So let us go ahead and proceed on. Let's talk about the AWS Security Hub. Now, in this demo, what we're going to do is go through how to enable the Security Hub. But before we do that, we want to understand why we want to use it and why it provides you as an enterprise significant relief from vulnerabilities that could be occurring in your AWS environment. Generally, the Security Hub is going to provide you a view of your security status. This is, again, going to be a tool that is integrated into AWS to help you maintain security and compliance. Basically, it shows you exactly how it works here, very straightforward, and it integrates with other security services like GuardDuty, Inspector, and Macie as well. It's going to give you a single view and allows you to drill down into that view. And what's nice about it is it provides you detailed findings and then also actionable insight where you could automatically make changes as needed. So over here to get started, we need to first enable the service. Now there is a cost to that and the pricing is here. They do give you a 30-day free trial. So go here to Security Hub and you can see here that security standards that are enabled. First is the CIS AWS Foundations Benchmark. Now CIS is essentially going to be listed here. This is the Center for Internet Security, and they have benchmarks that are specific to certain platforms. One is the AWS CIS benchmark. This is version 1.2.0. And if we go back here, you can see that that is the version that they are referencing. So what they've done is they've basically imported the best practices from CIS into the Security Hub. And if you just go ahead and select the link here, fill out that information, and then go through this cookie thing, it'll basically send you the list, the checklist that you would go through. Well, you don't really need to do that because it is here automatically. It'll populate this for you. Then there's also PCI DSS. This is, again, the payment card industry. And it is also integrated with these services. So what we do next is select Enable Security Hub. And you can see here that it's going to provide a summary. And there's no findings yet because, again, it still needs to run. And it's going through the standards now. This is going to take a little while. And in the meantime, we'll come back when it is ready. And you'll see once it's done, it'll start populating any insights that come up, such as perhaps multi-factor authentication isn't enabled. It'll also look at user activity as well. There isn't too much going on this demo account, but it will start populating areas when it finds something. We'll go back after it is completed here and check on it. Now this will take a little while, so it could be 40 minutes, it could be an hour. It just depends on what you have in your environment, the workload, etc. Okay, so the CIS benchmarks have been uploaded, and we could see there that there's a security score of 0, and that's because there really hasn't been anything that has been ran or populated as of yet. However, once you start deploying additional services, this will start populating, and it generally does take about 24 hours for it to really start syncing up. So if you check it again once you deploy it in about 24 hours, you will see, for example, down here, insight into like S3 or EC2, which I do have services deployed around EC2, EBS, etc. So they do take some time. Typically about 24 hours is about the expectation that you should have for it to take. Let's go ahead and move on to the next module. Now, one area of cloud computing that is true pretty much whether you use AWS or Google, Azure, IBM Cloud, etc., there's what's called typically a shared responsibility model. Now, this model in AWS is pretty specific. They're very clear about it. And why this is important is that it really points out to you as a customer what you need to handle and what AWS will handle. And they break this down really specifically. You could see here, the blue is the customer and orange is AWS. For example, you're responsible for your own data. They don't manage your data, and again, they're not going to retrieve your data. It's up to you to take care of your data. They're also not going to set up your accounts or anything like that. That is your call. You're also responsible for setting up security groups, your firewall, for example, that's security groups, your configurations, deploying your operating systems on your EC2 instances, etc. And you're also responsible for ensuring that your connection from on-prem to AWS is secure, for example, as well. Those are just some of the things that you as a customer really need to be aware of. Now, AWS is going to manage basically the hardware, the infrastructure on the back end. They'll also handle the compute services, the data centers itself. But again, everything below deploying the hypervisor and below is AWS. And then everything above that is really up to you as a customer. Now, some of the services like EBS will be managed by AWS, like load balancing, etc. in the back end. Again, some managed services, they'll do a little bit more, but generally this is pretty clear in what you need to understand is your responsibility, and then what is the AWS's responsibility. With that said, the link basically for the shared responsibility model is actually pretty clear. And they tell you what are shared controls. And some of these are application layer, customer layer, infrastructure layer, and again, how those are handled. But lastly, again, the best way to review this is to go to the link here. That is aws.amazon.com, compliance and shared responsibility model. If you just type into your search engine, AWS shared responsibility model, it'll bring you over to this page. Once again, this is very important to understand what you need to handle and then what AWS handles. Let's move on. AWS Security Best Practices. When it comes to AWS Security Best Practices, it's important to, of course, consider the shared security model. Now, we know this shared security model is a model that's used between the provider and the customer, the consumer, to have some kind of documented expectations around who does what. So when we understand what we're supposed to do as a customer, we then could go into understanding what services fit where. Again, we discussed these earlier briefly, and apply basically some of these services with some of the best practices that we should consider. Now, a lot of these best practices are really your straightforward IT security 101 requirements. So for example, if I deploy a host OS on AWS on EC2, and this EC2 instance is running Windows, and I know I need to patch that OS if I'm going to keep it running, again, for many good reasons. So patching is important. One of the things we should look at, too, is disabling root accounts. If we don't need to have that root account opened up, then disable it. We, of course, need a root account, but we shouldn't really have it open to the world, right? So we need to secure it. Multi-factor authentication. We should also enforce that, so make sure we don't just have a password, that maybe we add another factor as part of our authentication scheme. We should also consider rotating and changing our access keys every 60 to 90 days. Also, too, the principle of least privilege comes into play here. It's important to realize that we shouldn't be granting access to everyone in the same manner. We need to look at the role. We need to look at the use case, the requirements, the permissions, all these little things come into play. So don't just give everybody privileges to deploy every service. If we're granting AWS accounts, we need to really understand what they really need. Trusted Advisor. So we should be using Trusted Advisor routinely in our environments. This is an AWS specific best practice. So use this to find, what I call the low hanging fruit, right? It's going to let you know right in your face that you should really do this. It's really hard to miss things when they're pointing out directly to you what you really should look at. Auditing. We should always be auditing and understanding who does what, why, how, etc. And then when it comes to some additional best practices, specifically for AWS, we should always consider RDS for deploying data services such as relational data service, or database service, I should say. We should create specific group permissions so that only the RDS instances that should be accessing that group from a specific location, we need to, of course, specify that explicitly. This is similar to like whitelisting is another way to look at it. CloudFront SSLs. We should always validate that the server has the current certificates. And again, very basic stuff that we should be doing. But in AWS, it's pretty straightforward. So always take that into consideration. Let's go ahead and move on to the next part of the course.